You know, it's about time for a lead female superhero movie. I mean, besides those. And besides those, too. Black Widow. It's the most recent Marvel superhero movie, especially to come out in theaters after COVID, and this is our first film into Phase 4 of the MCU. The film was directed by Kate Shortland, and it was written by Eric Pearson, who's actually worked on previous Marvel films before. I know there was a little bit of excitement for this movie because it's yet another lead female superhero movie, which, to be fair, we don't have a lot of. Previously, there had been a lot of excitement for Captain Marvel, but with some lukewarm reviews, I feel like Black Widow was kind of there to sort of pick up some of the disappointment. And for the most part, I feel like it does a pretty decent job. I would call this movie sort of like a spy thriller action flick. So if that is your type of genre, you'll definitely really like this movie. Unfortunately though, I think when it came to like a lot of its action scenes, I feel like it was a little bloated. So compared to shows like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which really established a lot and a lot of characters, I feel like this movie is not quite on the same level. Nonetheless though, it's a pretty solid flick. Now, I had known this movie was going to be a prequel, especially after the events in Endgame. I had kind of assumed through the advertising that this was going to be a sort of like far back in the beginning of the MCU series, where she and Hawkeye were going to have some adventures, especially after talking about their adventure in Budapest. But unfortunately, that's not what we're getting here. It does come up, but this is really more about Black Widow while she's on the run after the events in Civil War, but before Infinity War. So if you're not really caught up with the MCU, you might be a little confused about the placement and the timeline, but for the most part though, I don't really think you need to be all that knowledgeable about the previous movies. I mean, you need to have seen some of them at least, but for the most part, I think the movie stands pretty well on its own without necessarily connecting to all the other films. Okay, so what's the movie about? The movie actually starts us off in 1995 with a young Natasha Romanoff, along with her family in Ohio, only to find out her entire family are Russian spies planted into American culture. And I have to note this one little detail is that one of the kids actually grabs a My Little Pony plushie, and it's very clear this design is for the modern My Little Pony, which did not exist until the 2010s. So this was sort of a bizarre error on the prop master's part. So I just thought that was kind of a funny little tidbit. But then again, you could also argue that this is multiverse shit, so maybe My Little Pony existed earlier in the 90s? I mean, you could argue, whatever. So Natasha, again played by Scarlett Johansson, is on the run and hiding out after the events of Civil War until she's tracked down by a fearsome antagonist named Taskmaster. And I gotta say, Taskmaster is a brilliant idea. I love the fact that we have this soldier who's actually hooked up into learning enemy movesets. Kind of like entering the Matrix, how Keanu Reeves, learned Kung Fu by plugging into the system. I don't know, it's kind of neat. And you see a lot of really cool movesets. Like you see Captain America's moves, Black Panther, Hawkeye, etc. Unfortunately, I feel like we don't get a lot of time with Taskmaster, and I would have really loved to have seen them to actually really expand their ability and their arsenal as well. Because unfortunately, the main antagonist is kind of dull. He's some kind of Russian boss named Drakov, played by Ray Winstone, who basically operates the Black Widow program. Yeah, we come to find out there's dozens, if not hundreds of Black Widows all over the world, basically doing his bidding, manipulating events around the world, especially politically, and Natasha is one of the few that got away and joined the Avengers. So the other character of note is another Black Widow named Yelena, played by Florence Pugh, who actually served as Natasha's little sister in America, and she's given an antidote that breaks her out of her brainwashing, so she tries to meet up with Natasha to try to kind of fix this whole setup going on. Which means they also need to get information from their previous, family members, including the mother, played by Rachel Weisz, and the Red Guardian, played by David Harbour. So the entire flick is really all about fighting the Black Widow program, which is actually pretty cool and means there's a lot of long action scenes. And like I had said previous, sometimes these action scenes do kind of go on for a very long time. And I do kind of have this thing about action sequences that if they go on too long, the action can get kind of dull after a while, which unfortunately Black Widow, the movie, is kind of falls into sometimes. That's not to say the characters aren't likable or that there's still a lot of really cool moves that we get to see. Although it's funny because after seeing a lot of the Avengers going through their own battles, getting scars and bruises, even to this day, it doesn't seem like women are allowed to be too bruised or too beaten up, unless you have this one shirtless scene that Scarlett Johansson has just to show her, oh, she's been through rough times. But don't worry, her hair is still in one place. That does kind of lead into the discussion about this utilizing sort of female empowerment tropes Yeah, there's been a discussion going around that Black Widow has kind of been stepping her toe into this sort of like gender equality, kind of message. Because she's never really needed it before, she's just always been a badass. So I would say there are some tropes there that I would have liked to have seen done a little bit differently. Because the main plot of the movie is you have this big, bad, old, fat, abusive man kidnapping a bunch of girls, putting them through a lot of hell just so that they become agents that he can control. So it's all about getting control back, being empowered. And on one hand, that is a good obstacle for our main character, but at the same time I'm thinking, but hasn't she done enough that I feel like it doesn't have to be a women versus a man thing? It could just be her saving a bunch of agents. I'm not really familiar with the story in the comic book, but you could have had male and female agents that she was saving so that it didn't feel so like lopsided, if that makes any sense. So on one hand, I would say, I think in the concept, there's sort of these tropish things going on with the female empowerment, and they're not necessarily bad. They're not really in your face like previous films have been. So I honestly think they're pretty harmless when it comes to that. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, I do think Black Widow is a badass, and it's great seeing her in her own solo flick. But one other fault I have for the movie, though, is I feel like it does kind of lack some humor until some key characters enter the scene. Yelena herself actually brings quite a few quips, but it's not until we get the Red Guardian that we have a lot of our humor. Which unfortunately is a big gripe I have with the movie, is that they turn the Red Guardian kind of into a joke. I mean, this character's supposed to be like the antithesis of Captain America in the comic pages, and so to bring him onto the big screen and make him like a joke, it doesn't really seem fitting. They make him kind of pathetic, like he's living in the past, and kind of feeding into the notion of that female empowerment trope. I have noticed in a lot of female empowerment movies, they tend to dumb down the man, which I think is completely unnecessary. I mean, the Red Guardian could have actually been like some weird source of wisdom while still allowing Black Widow to serve that main role. So overall, I would say the movie is pretty flawed in a few different ways, sometimes in concept, and sometimes I feel like it's not quite as exciting as what we're used to, especially after some of the Disney Plus series that we have. The bar has been set really high, and this film unfortunately feels like 5 years too late coming out. It's still a pretty solid film, and I feel like a lot of people will really enjoy it, but it's not as interesting, creative, or impactful as some of the more recent movies and shows. And so Black Widow gets my score of 3 stars. Guys, thanks as always for watching. Have you all seen Black Widow? And if not, what else have you been watching lately? Comment below, let me know, and stay tuned right here if you all want to see more.